Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for checking out my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you some tips and tricks for Diablo 3. First tip is in the options menu. You're going to want to turn on both advanced tooltips and elective mode. Advanced tooltips is pretty self-explanatory. Elective mode is a little bit more involved. Basically, skills are divided into categories, and normally you can choose one skill per category to put onto your bars. With elective mode, you can choose more than one skill per category. As you can see, I have Poison Dart and Plague of Toads on my Witch Doctor, as well as Zombie Dogs and Spirit Walk. Next tip has to do with bag space. Bag space is limited in Diablo 3 and can fill up pretty quickly. It's best to avoid all white items, as they only sell for a couple of gold. Make room for all other items in your bags and just drop the white items. Unlike World of Warcraft, their value isn't worth the bag space. Also, do not buy the extra stash until later levels. Right now, you want to spend all of your gold on blacksmithing and jewel crafting. Finally, the last tip I have to show you today has to do with the force stand still button. By default, it's on shift. I found shift to be kind of annoying, so I switch it to space. Space is normally used for closing all the windows, so I changed that key binding to tab. Now, the force stand still allows you to stand still and use a ranged weapon. So that's my tips and tricks video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Please subscribe and let me know of any improvements I can make.
This is Dreadnought, and we're here just days before release of Diablo 3, and we're going to talk today about barbarian skills, and more specifically barbarian skills for speed leveling. So this is not for you hardcore players, PvPers, or people wanting tips in Infernal already. This is more of the 1 to 60 as fast as possible type talk. So before we get into the thicket of these skills, we're going to talk about our primary skills: Bash, Frenzy, and Cleave. We're going to talk about the merits of them and a little bit of a DPS chart, although Diablo 3 isn't really a game style based on DPS, but we can do some simple calculations to give us a better idea of what we're going to use all three of these abilities for. Let's talk about Bash real quick, generating 6 Fury. This is actually going to be the Fury Builder primary, mostly because of Instigation. It's going to give us 100% Fury increase. So that's every swing we're going to be generating 12 Fury. That's pretty ridiculous when you look at how much Fury even our biggest abilities cost. Real quick for our calculations, we're going to assume 100 weapon damage just to make all these calculations as simple as possible in a 1 attack speed. Onslaught rune and Pulverized rune are going to be the DPS enhancing runes. You can see the calculations here sometimes assume group size for these AoE abilities, and that's what makes Diablo 3 calculations so difficult, is trying to figure out what your average group size is going to be. But if you've played beta, you know that average group size is not going to be 1 or 2. It's usually pretty big groups, so our AoE abilities are usually the way to go when we're trying to clear things quickly. So for Pulverized, we're going to assume 3.5 on average are going to be hit by this, and that's going to give us a little bit of a DPS advantage over Onslaught unless we're doing single target DPS. Punish is going to increase all of our abilities damage, so that's definitely one to look at for some of your builds. It's actually an 18% when it stacks 3 times, but we're just going to assume 12 is an average for our damage increase because you're not going to start with 3 stacks. Instigation is a must for some of your builds because there's not an easier way to generate Fury than an Instigation Bash. Just hitting for 12 Fury each time is ridiculous. Clobber, it's not a bad ability. We're not going to talk about it though because it's more of a survivability, and we're not worried about survivability just yet. Maybe when we get to Hell mode, we'll open up the Clobber and Triumph Smite and some of these other survivability. But we're going to plan for best case scenario, trying to get through things as fast as possible, and we're not really going to look at these survivability runes. Frenzy is going to generate 3 per swing, but when we look at the 75% attack speed increase that we can gain from Frenzy, we're getting up to about 5.25 worth of Fury because of that speed increase. So it's still not going to get up to where Bash is at 6 Fury without the Instigation rune, but we're going to do a little bit more single target DPS. Maniac is an awesome single target DPS. Sidearm for those bosses where you want to take out some of the mobs. Also, we're assuming that it's going to hit 3 on average, which could be totally wrong. So if you think that's a 5 or a 2, then you can just sub in there that 5 or 2 to calculate your damage. But from what I've seen so far, 3 is pretty close. Vanguard, 15% movement increase. Definitely take a look at that. Triumph Smite. If you're dying a lot, then go ahead and break those out. But if you're not, don't worry about them. Cleave is going to be our group damage ability, and Frenzy and Bash really don't compare when we're looking at Cleave, and you might already be looking at this too that we're assuming for enemies hit, and that can be much higher than that if you're planning your Cleaves out right. You can be hitting 5, 6 per swing and averaging 3 or 4 and doing a lot more damage than this 240, which is still a sizable amount without Rune. Rupture is an awesome rune that you get early on, and you'll probably be using Rupture for a long time just because it's a great rune, increasing your AoE damage. Broad Sweep, very comparable to Rupture. Reaping Swing is a must look at, giving you another 3 Fury per swing, so those Fury intensive builds, Cleave with Reaping Swing just might be the way to go, and it's what I have my eye on for later levels, but Rupture definitely for early game. These are the survivability runes. So really when we look at it, single target DPS, Frenzy comes out in the lead a little bit over Bash, and then Cleave in the end. Group DPS, it's Cleave all the way. Frenzy and Bash have some group DPS runes, but nothing comparing to Cleave. Fury Generation, Bash, and definitely Bash with this Instigation rune that you're going to get later on, but even without that, Bash is already giving you 6 Fury on runes, so then Cleave, then Frenzy. So a lot of people get these two mixed up. Frenzy seems like it's going to generate more than Cleave, but you'd have to be almost perfect with that stack to average above Cleave, and if you have Reaping Swing, then there's no way that you're going to beat Cleave with Frenzy. So you're probably going to have utility for all 3 of these. There's no just one best ability. It's more of an instance base, and even though you can't switch all of these abilities right away, there's a little bit of a cooldown. It's going to be useful to switch between group damage and boss damage. So let's look real quick at some examples of builds. A lot of these come from forums or similar builds from forums, people posting and saying, hey, what do you think about this? So let's look at this build real quick. This is actually an example of a bad build, and we're going to talk about why it's a bad build in a second here. But we see Frenzy, Hammer of the Ancients, Sprint, Wrath Berserker, Call of the Ancients, Battle Rage. These are all great abilities, but there's a big problem here, and it's the #1 most important thing to plan out as a barbarian is your Fury generation versus Fury cost. So really this build only has Frenzy as its Fury generator, and Frenzy is not a great Fury generator, but the real issue here is that we have 5 Fury spenders. So really we're just going to be spamming Frenzy and then every once in a while using one of these abilities, and really just a waste of these abilities to not be able to use very often. Alright, let's look at an example of a good build, and this is a build that has been floating around the forums. It's called the Dread Bomb build, really because the whole build is built around the Dread Bomb. So let's look at the merits and the downside of this build. We look here, we have Cleave with a Reaping Swing that's going to give us the additional Fury, Leap,